We spend so much time chasing the external markers of leadership, the title, the KPIs, the headcount, and almost no time asking the harder questions. Who is actually showing up to lead? In this conversation, Adair and I find ourselves returning again and again to the same uncomfortable truth, whether we're talking about perimenopause, people-pleasing, or working inside giants like Microsoft and Google. Because it turns out none of the external work lands if the internal work hasn't been done first. Your nervous system sets the tone. Your energy speaks before you do. How you show up is the culture. I'm Dr. Tamsin and Adair, and this is Hot Habits, Conscious Leadership in Action. Well, welcome. Today, I am joined by Adair Cates, who leads the conscious leadership practice at Exchange. She blends neuroscience, mindfulness, and breathwork into conversations that don't just inspire change, they rewire it. Adair's work upgrades leaders from the inside out. She's also one of the people who helps me stop apologizing for what gets labeled woo, which is a word I genuinely loathe, and she helped me start naming it for what it actually is. Human operating system maintenance. Adair is also a fierce advocate for women in midlife, perimenopause here, who are learning to lead from a place of being deeply well-resourced rather than running on empty and burning out. With more than 20 years guiding personal and professional transformation, she's helped companies like Microsoft and Meta unlock potential through conversations that are equal parts science, soul, and practical magic. Add in her life as the mom of twins, bonus mom of 3, author and partner, and now fiance to John Berghoff in building a global leadership movement. And you've got someone who doesn't just teach transformation, she lives it. And in our personal WhatsApp messages, we've exchanged conversations around Existential Kink, the wonderful book by Carolyn Elliott, and the importance of surfacing that which we naturally hide. Adair is someone who brings depth, presence, and humanity into leadership in a very lived way. Welcome, Adair.
Aw, what a thoughtful introduction, Tamsin. Thank you so much. I'm so honored to be here with you.
I'm so excited that you're here having this conversation today about conscious leadership and habits and that joyful stage of midlife that we are both in right now.
Here we are.
So I like to start my Hot Habits podcast conversations by asking my guests to bring in an object with them, something that represents a hot habit in their life. So this is a way of bringing leadership out of theory and into your everyday reality. So what object did you bring with you today, and why did you choose it?
Well, can I share 2?
Sure.
Okay.
Break the rules. I love it.
All right. I'm breaking the rules in the first, 2 minutes of the podcast. That's perfect. So I always keep this crystal heart on my desk because the habit of living from my heart doesn't always come naturally for me. I can be very heady and neuroscience-y and in my head versus my heart. So this object reminds me to practice heart coherence, to breathe through my heart, to tune into my heart, to drop the walls around my heart, to be vulnerable, to bring intimacy into the work that I do. And trust me, I need the reminder.
That's awesome. I mean, what's interesting about that too is I feel like that's something, what's interesting is that you flag that as a habit that you've had to cultivate, right? But also, I feel like that's something that in the corporate world is not like front and center, and that you kind of going, hey, let me just put this front and center creates a different kind of lead into the conversations and interactions you have.
Well, thank you for noticing that. I think especially this day and age where, we have AI and instant gratification and, instant feedback and this desire and this need to, I'm thinking of just these dopamine hits that we get, right? And that really feels like, I feel like the head part of us, but we really need this day and age, the oxytocin. We need the heart fuel. We need the slow down, connect, get intimate, let's get cozy together. Because the other world is there in droves and we have plenty of it everywhere we look. And so this heart is a reminder to not get too pulled into what the world is saying is really important right now and to keep tuning in to what's really important to me.
I love that also, that acknowledgement of the personal in the way you do this work, right? Because it's very easy to sort of go into these interactions and these situations and these, corporate engagements, right? Are kind of contracts, and it's all sort of follow the rules, and this is the deliverable, and this is the KPI. And it's just like, I'm a human in this experience. And that's what you're really flagging. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm a human, and we don't have to go into it now, but to me, that is the beauty of midlife and the beauty of perimenopause is it's become so obvious that leaning into my heart is an important piece of who I am, but I've masked it and put it to the side and said, this is another part of me. And I feel like in this midlife stage, it's like, oh, well, I can't hide that anymore. It's like, it just wants to be here.
I love that. And I would love to circle back around into the perimenopause and the way that it forces us to sort of reckon with the habits we have.
Mhm. Yes,
Also,
definitely.
right?
That's
And
a good way to put it.
right? And redefine what conscious leadership means in this stage, right?
Do you want me to show the other object?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, because you said conscious leadership, so this kind of goes along with this. Well, I have right beside of me this conscious leadership journal, which is a part of our conscious leadership accelerator program at Exchange. And why this object reminds me of, the hot habit is because journaling, every day, journaling is such an important part of what I do. And whether it be in this journal or currently I'm in this, deep into a sacred prayer journal that I'm using every single day, me connecting with my thoughts through the written word is a habit that really helps me to tune in to that more creative part of who I am, of my true essence. So the journal is another really key object.
I mean, there's a couple of things I'd love to sort of dig in with this. And I love that our conversations can always go in a million different ways.
Yes, me too. It's fun.
But the first thing I wanted to sort of flag is, and maybe it'd be helpful for you to define what you mean by conscious leadership. But one of the things that you're articulating about journaling, which I was massively resistant to because it felt to me like it wasn't productive. A little bit like meditating. So many of these kind of things that I know resource me and I know help me do better in all the things that I care about. When it when you go to the gym or you take a class, you're like, ka-ching, I've got my steps in, I've done my cardio, I've done my right. But something about journaling and meditating for me, sometimes when I'm feeling the call of work and feeling pulled into family and all of the other things, the sort of the immediate productivity part of it doesn't feel as explicit. But what you acknowledge, and one of the things that I know from journaling for 20 years, is that when I journal, it moves things from the unconscious to the conscious often. And it creates a level of kind of objectivity, which when we're in that kind of subjective swirl, we get lost in.
Yes, and I feel like things get lost inside of us. And I've often found that journaling is something I need to do every single day, but every single day I don't always have some big aha or insight or, meaningful download that I'm like, oh, this is life-changing. But it is truly that gradual habit of, okay, I'm going to devote this time and energy and space to these words in this moment. It's the habit itself that ultimately lends to, again, going back, feeling more connected to my heart and what matters most to me and feeling more connected to, where I'm going, like what direction I might be moving in. And, we define conscious leadership in our work as being aware of our influence. And being aware of our influence, there's no way we can be aware of it until we know what's happening inside of us. I think so many of us think that influence is this outward expression. And what I've learned through this work, that it is deeply internal first and foremost. And so that connecting with myself through writing, it's the gateway, it's the opening of self-leadership. It's the opening of self-responsibility. Like things show up sometimes in my journal that I'm like, crap, I didn't know that was there. Like, I kind of hate that I just admitted that to myself, but I did. So what am I going to do with that now? And then I get to sit with it and be with it and notice it and take it wherever it might need to go next. But, influence to me and all in all of our conscious leadership work at Exchange is it's really all about self-leadership. Way before it is about how do you influence somebody else.
Yeah. No, and that's interesting. That sort of makes me also think about, is it a verb or a noun? Right?
Yes,
Like, what are
yes.
you doing with that word? And I think, what's interesting about what you said too is the vital nature of looking within if you are going to be a successful leader. And I feel like one of the things that has shifted, it was when I read Vishen Lakhiani's book, The Buddha and the Badass, the guy who started Mind Valley. He talks about the Buddha is that intuitive looking within, being willing to slow down and figure out what's going on inside. And then the badass is the kind of entrepreneurial energy of like being willing to take the risk and to rebel and to create something new and to kind of step into the unknown. And it's weaving those two together that makes us good leaders. And I feel like, since COVID, there's been a much bigger shift when a lot of us were suddenly working from home and all of our roles suddenly collided with each other when it was easy to have boundaries before. And it created this energy around, oh, I have to look within, right? If I'm going to be successful at any of these things. And so I can really understand how I'm showing up as a mother, as a partner, as a business owner, as a friend, when it's all happening in the same space and in the same time often, right?
Yeah, and the irony for that for me is for years, like even when I was in the corporate world doing internal leadership development inside of companies, I oftentimes craved and talked about, even in a lot of my teachings, this whole idea of not work-life balance, but work-life integration. And it's really been the thing I've craved more than anything throughout my entire career is how can I just show up as me everywhere to where I don't feel like here's home version of me, here's work version of me. But to me, just that being that authentic expression is so incredibly important. And again, to me, that is conscious leadership. It's how can I show up as the authentic version of myself wherever I go? And that's not to say that you're going to necessarily have the exact same types of conversations or deep, relationships or whatever it might be. However, how much of myself am I able to reveal? And for me, the more of myself that I can reveal in any space, the more I feel at home in the world. When I feel like I'm hiding something or I'm filtering myself or I'm not really being true to my own values in a situation, I just feel like something's missing. And I don't want that anymore in my life. And I think this, again, goes back to that midlife phase that we're in. It's really hard as we get, older and our hormones shift. It's hard for us to be someone other than who we are. Those filters start to dissolve a little bit.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And I was reading this post the other day because I follow a lot of perimenopausal, menopausal feminist writers on Substack. And one of them was saying that, the reason that women end their marriages in menopause and perimenopause is not because they, have suddenly had enough. It's because they have suddenly not got the protective nature of all of the hormones, which has allowed them to tolerate a lot of the BS that they were dealing with before. And that is a reframe for me I found really fascinating, right? So this idea of I just don't have it in me to fake it anymore, And I think, one of the things that's interesting is I grew up with a very sort of active dinner party dining table conversation in my family when I was a child. My father is a Jungian analyst, and we always had these deep conversations at the table. And one of the things my mom said to me, which I've revisited more, particularly as in the sort of more perimenopausal state, was my mom said to me, if you want to build intimacy with people, you need to be willing to talk about what you find hard and not just talk about what you find easy and that everything's fine. And for me, that really set in motion this idea that I find it hard to be in relationships with people who are just the everything's fine. I'm like, really? Really? Is that really true? Like what's going on in there? Come on, let's get a bit deeper. And so for me, it's that pulling of that sort of personal into the way I work in business too. So that leads me to the next question I had for you, which was, was there a moment, like, did you have an epiphany moment, or was it a sort of gradual realization that this work couldn't stay personal, right? And that it really was important for you to bring all of this kind of inner work into how you lead and how you facilitate and how you show up, in your work role, not just in your personal life.
There was one moment, it kind of goes back to the idea we were talking about with the journaling, which Susan Scott, she says something in her writing around conversations and human connections that things happen gradually and then suddenly. So I think it was like gradually I realized over time, like something feels off. Just that feeling of like something doesn't feel quite right. And for a long time, I could tolerate that feeling in my body. But more and more, it actually showed up in my body as like a nausea or just a sensation in my gut where I could be like, this is really off. And even though I couldn't name it, I could still name that it was off. And I think just over time, what I found is when I don't feel aligned or like I'm being the truest version of myself, I just feel so uncomfortable, but not in like the growth way, like I feel like a uncomfortable contraction, not that like uncomfortable, like, ooh, I'm also expanding in this, it's like a uncomfortable contraction. And then, so gradually it's noticing all of those things. And again, this to me goes back to the core of our work, which is the pausing, the noticing, the choosing, the resourcing myself. The more we do that, the more we can feel those incongruent moments. And then the more we have the ability to influence our life and change it, but not change it in the like, I'm going to go change this thing. I'm going to make this happen. I'm going to like mold this exactly the way I want it. No, it's oh shit, this is really uncomfortable. Let me just accept that discomfort and then surrender it to a higher power to say, okay, this is what is. Thank you. And now what? And there's not this, I'm learning, and again, still very much in my learning phase with all of this idea of surrender and tapping into a higher power, tapping into God to say like, thank you for this hard thing. Because I know it means that something is, if I hold this in a certain way, if I hold it with gratitude, if I hold it with acceptance, then it has the possibility to actually shift.
Yeah, and that's a big sort of shift in the energy. I started studying Buddhism about 15, 20 years ago. And as you were talking, it was reminding me of this quote from one of my teachers, which was, when you are stuck in anger, resist any of those sort of negative, heavy energies, it's like drinking poison and hoping the other person's going to die, right?
Yeah, but I feel like I lived like most of my life like that. Here we are, you're a projector just like I am in human design, like that underlying resentment of I'm holding it all together, but underneath I'm seething. But yes, part of me thought that would actually change the other person.
Right. No, and then what's been really powerful in my work in conscious leadership, when I led my conscious leadership program with a university recently, one of the participants turned up at one of the sessions and said, I've had a stressful relationship with a colleague for years, and I couldn't imagine it ever changing. But I decided after our last call to do some heart math work before I went into my meeting with her. And I really got into that generative, loving, kindness, compassionate, energetic state before I went into my meeting with her. And she said, and it completely shifted our interaction. And she said, for years, I thought if both of us didn't make a change, nothing would happen. And that for me was such a sort of powerful acknowledgement that, that when we get stuck in this work, we so often are trying to drag somebody else along with us, right?
Yeah.
And that so often if you can just do the work, it can have this massive energetic impact and change the way we engage, right?
100% yes. And that's, to me, again, that goes all the way back to self-leadership and the taking the responsibility. If something is not as we want it to be in our life, if there is a difficult relationship, if there's a challenging situation that we just can't quite figure out how to get through, if we start with the resourcing of ourselves, take a deep breath, get into the heart space, if we can allow ourselves to do that. Sometimes we can't, and we just need to find a neutral place. And yes, that energy shift inside of us changes the interactions. That's where the influence transfer takes place. But it first starts in us. It's not, like you said, waiting for the other person to make a change. I mean, I think that's kind of the best news ever, right? Because that means we get to take it on for ourselves. Maybe it's the best news, worst news. Like it's the best news because guess what? We have some dominion over that. We get to exercise power there. And yet we have the responsibility. If we want it to change, we have to change it inside of ourselves first. And oftentimes it is just, how are we holding it? There's nothing to do. It's how are we holding it? Are we holding it with gratitude, with acceptance, with surrender? Or are we holding it with a grudge or with resentment or with negativity?
So I'm thinking about skepticism, right, of this way, right? Like, what does skepticism towards this, for want of a better word, like the inner work or the personal responsibility or the, oh shit, it's really up to me kind of part of like working with leaders? So what does that look like in your experience? And how have you met it in a way that has, been successful?
I love that question. You might not like my answer, and the listeners might not like my answer, but really it's my answer to almost everything, which is starting within yourself. Again, shifting the way I hold it. So if someone is coming at me with skepticism and I respond to that with fear or anxiety or mistrust or disrespect or who knows what might come out in that moment, then the person feels that. But if I receive the skepticism with empathy and compassion and permission to go where you choose to go with this, and sometimes it's a little push to say like, hey, just try it. We're going to do a breath practice. I know that you might feel resistant. I know that this might be strange for you. I know you might think, there's no way this is going to work. In fact, I myself was a huge breath skeptic. Like, that's part of my journey. The skeptics often end up being your biggest fans, right? Because they have the highest barrier. But if they choose to lower it, if you can allow them to have permission to be where they are with it, to feel the resistance instead of just glossing over it, then they can find the space oftentimes to give it a shot, to try it.
I love that. So kind of continuing down this sort of path of like working with leaders and kind of thinking about what it means to be, a well-resourced leader. What's something that you used to believe about leadership that you don't anymore?
Well, I think something I used to believe is that leadership is a role, that you have to have direct reports. I kind of grew up in corporate leadership development. I've been out of that for quite a while now, but I grew up in that. So I still had this belief of like, oh, you're a leader if you have direct reports. You're a leader if you have a certain sign on your door. You're a leader if you're, a leader in your community or whatever designation where someone has put you in that position. But in our own way, we're all leaders. And even just the word leader, I've had to learn how to embrace that word with conscious leadership, because I'm often like, I don't know if that's the best label for it, which is why we define it as being aware of your influence. Leadership now is, to me, it's not a role, it's influence. And Dr. Danny, one of our mentors and our OG mentor in this work, used to say, you cannot not have influence. We always have influence no matter what. And even the word influence, again, we think it's outer, but it really starts inside of ourselves. And influence isn't just, oh, I'm going to influence someone or manipulate. Some people might even go there. But it's, how am I influencing my experience of life? Because I get to influence how I experience life just by the perspective I hold, how well resourced I am, how I'm holding, as we said before, energetically inside of me. What am I choosing to hold? Am I being open and receptive and in my creative space? Or am I being closed down and in survival mode? So many of us, I mean, myself included, we live so much of our existence in that survival mode. We don't even realize that we're influencing our reality from a place of being in fear and in the lower part of our brain and in the hijacked part of our nervous system.
Yeah, and it's interesting. As you were talking, I was thinking a lot about hierarchy and how, the corporate world is often very much structured around hierarchy and this idea that leadership is sort of moving up through the hierarchy until you get to the peak, the pinnacle, right? And then you
Climbing
are
the corporate ladder,
right? Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And whether it's like, I was thinking about this the other day when I was doing my wills, and I was thinking that feels like me kind of stepping into a different role with respect to my parents and my children, because I'm thinking about, when I die, what is it going to look like for my children, right? Which is that sort of stepping more into that sort of matriarch role rather than being a child, right? And so thinking about like hierarchy and I think one of the things that I've loved about all of the facilitation training that I've done with Exchange is that what it's really allowed me to cultivate in spaces when I work with teams is what I describe when I'm working with teams is what I call the sort of flattening of the hierarchy. It's this recognition that everyone's voices in the room are wanted, needed, valuable, required. If we're talking about strategic planning, which I did with an organization recently, and we were talking about, and I said, I want you to forget your job title. And I want you to look at, the vision and the mission and the values of your organization and think about what you want to do to get there and not just do it based on your job title. And it created a really interesting shift because they were a team that had worked together, apart from one of them, for about 9 years. So they knew each other really well, but they hadn't ever really given themselves the permission to stop and think, this is not my job, my official job, right? But I have lots of ideas and thoughts about how to support you and what you're doing over here in this side of the business. And I think that's a sort of an interesting part when we're thinking about what it means to be a leader is the willingness to let go, right? Of your position, of the term, of the role, right? And just soften into, it's almost like when I did my first yoga teacher training about, it was 18 years ago. One of the things that we were taught is how can I be helpful? Right? When I enter a space, I enter a room, I enter an interaction. How can I be helpful as your kind of initial interaction rather than I'm coming at it from a place of expertise, knowledge, power, fill in the blank, right? And so I think as I'm sort of, verbally processing this, right? What is a leadership norm that you reject now?
Oh, man. As you were talking there, I was remembering this role that I stepped into in a small. I was in a larger organization, and I chose to take another role in a smaller organization. And I remember being really excited about it and showing up to the home office on the first day, and it was a pretty humble home office compared to I was in like, a Buckhead in Atlanta high rise in this like incredible office space that was like, very well built out and beautiful. And moved to this more humble, smaller organization. And one of the first things they asked me to do was to like furnish the training room that I would be leading a lot of my leadership work in. And I was just like, I remember being so offended.
Right, like being asked to make coffee because you're female or something, right?
I was like, what? And then I realized at some point, I'm like, oh, they are testing me here. They are seeing how I'm going to receive this. Like, am I going to receive this like, that's not my job, which is kind of what you were alluding to? Or am I going to perceive this as like, okay, I can do this. This is an important space for me to be happy in. And and we know, you and I both know that the space is such an important part of the facilitating those collective experiences where all voices are heard. And so I had to do just a reframe of like, okay, so what I've noticed for myself is anytime I'm offended by something, there's usually something deeper for me to learn.
Oh, do we want to hear that, Adair?
No. But this goes back to what your mom said about intimacy, right? Is like it never happens in the easy thing. It happens in the hard things. And sometimes the hard thing is admitting it to ourselves. It's not even in an interaction with someone else, but to admit to myself like, oh yeah, man, I was really offended by that. And instead of staying in that defensive mode, which to me, that is the survival instinct, is being defensive. Instead of staying there, trusting that if I'm offended by it, there's probably something deeper that I need to learn. Like, what's the reframe here? What's the lesson here? What needs to shift in me? Again, self-responsibility, self-leadership, resourcing, pausing, all of the things that we talk about in conscious leadership, it starts within.
All going back to the within, yeah. Oh, this is so juicy. So I would love to pivot back to, because I know this is important to you and I, we've had some conversations offline about this, the perimenopause, menopause, what kind of shift and sort of rethinking conscious leadership. Because one of the things that I've really noticed, and it's been helpful, a couple of things. Couple was to get diagnosed with ADHD was really helpful for me to understand the way that my brain works, the way I, get overly sensitive to some things and find myself getting stuck in other things. But also, working with a really lovely OBGYN and getting on the right kind of HRT to support me in this. But one of the things that I really noticed is that, which is the sort of not what you're supposed to do as a projector in human design, which is that I've always been the busiest person. I was the classic, volunteered for all my kids' PTAs, made the snacks. And it wasn't like I would go to Target and buy the cupcakes. I was making the fucking cupcakes at 5 a.m. I was breaking the bread from scratch. I was like sewing their outfits and little, right? And it was, so for me, one of the big shifts in the sort of way that I've really embraced my own personal relationship with conscious leadership as being to sort of, it's almost like letting go of an addiction to the adrenaline and the cortisol and the being busy. And I remember I dated a guy about 5 or 6 years ago who said to me, do you ever not have something on your calendar? And I was like, well, it doesn't count if it's like going to a Pilates class or a yoga class on Saturday morning at 9 o'clock. He's like, that is still something on your fucking calendar. And I was like, but it's excellent, right? So that for me has been a big part of my reframe of conscious leadership, is releasing that addiction to always having pressure and deadlines and like more to do, right? So I would love to know what you have like noticed about your relationship to how you conceive of your own kind of conscious leadership and moving through this world as you've started to, dig into this joyful stage of entering the crone years. And we need to come up with a better word, by the way, little offshoot here than crone, because I don't.
Well, let me reframe crone for you really quick.
Okay, love it.
Do you know where crone comes from?
Mm-hmm.
crown.
Ooh. Okay.
So it's the queen era.
I see that.
I read that and I was like, that works for me. I can be
Yeah.
a crone now. Sometimes I know you love words. So sometimes just those word changes of like, oh, this really means that? Whoa, that sounds way better. So midlife for me was I just onset of like really difficult physical symptoms. Like, and things that are not, I feel like back in the day it was always like hot flashes. And I'm like, I'm not having hot flashes, but I am having heart palpitations. My eyes are not working. I'm having anxiety like I've never had in my life. And you name it, like multiple other things happening at one time. And again, I think it was the whole gradually and then suddenly. And so I found myself, maybe 6 or 8 months ago in like a really bad place, physically, mentally, emotionally. Fortunately, I was being supported by a functional health professional who was helping me to recognize, like through blood work, like, hey, here's some of the things you might be going on in your body. There's symptoms, and then there's, physiologically what's going on. And eventually I was able to get on some HRT, and that has been a game changer. So I think the first thing is just if you're having, one of the 50 plus symptoms that you can have from perimenopause, just ask ChatGPT what they are. It's probably, if you're between 40 and 50, it's probably perimenopause. I mean, I can look back now and realize like I've been dealing with this for years, but didn't actually realize it. So the physical part was the first thing. The second thing that I've really been like in, and I'm probably going to be in it for a while because that's the purpose of this point of life, is our brain changes dramatically when we're not getting the same amount of estrogen. And it affects like all parts of our brain and then ultimately like our whole being. And really what's being stripped away, and you alluded to this earlier, is that like protective, pleasing layer that the estrogen allows for. And as that starts to go, the filters go, I love the whole we do not care club, like all of that, like, and that they're like, we're supposed to get there because ultimately we are, as like the grandmothers, we are, and if this goes back to, I can't remember the name of the tribe, but I learned this through Dr. Mindy Pell's, her work. She wrote a book called Age Like a Girl, fantastic book. But she talks about, I think it's the Havza tribe, where the grandmothers were such an essential part of everybody being fed and taken care of. And when the men couldn't get the hunt, which was often, they didn't kill a big beast, then the grandmothers, they were harvesting tubers and, taking care of the grandchildren and all these things. And we are really meant to be leaders. This part of our life is the letting go of this people pleasing thing to really step into like ownership of who we are so that we can lead from that more whole place. And I can feel a lot of that happening in my life. And, I see it affecting how I interact with my kids, with my partner. And, it's not easy because a lot of the things that help build good relationships involve a lot of the things that having the estrogen go away, like it makes it harder. And so I've really had to have a lot of grace and compassion when I get really frustrated or angry or irritated or want to blow up. We talk about in our conscious leadership work, the reactivity. Well, in this phase of life, like there is some reactivity happening because our fuse is shorter because we don't have the estrogen to lengthen the fuse, right? To have the patience. So really, it's come down to self-compassion and just self-understanding and again, I not needing somebody else to change for me to be okay, but recognizing that sometimes I just need to have immense self-compassion and grace that I'm in this phase of life where a lot is changing and it's going to feel uncomfortable and I might be more reactive than I need to be. But I also know from our conscious leadership work that if I'm reactive, I can always go back and repair. I can apologize. I can say to my kids, I'm sorry I overreacted and yelled when I shouldn't have yelled, or go back to my partner and say, I'm really sorry that I said that. So it's the combination of being okay with myself when I'm reactive, and then also knowing that I'm human, I'm going to mess up, and I also can repair.
I love the repair piece. And I think for me, where the repair shows up a lot is, I call it sort of toxic hyper independence. That is often what happens when you are a mother, a divorced, business owner, fill in the gap, fill in all the blanks, right? But how easy it is to be. And also I find the difference between living in the US and being in Europe, where I spent the first half of my life. And for me, a lot of the repair is, I'm very lucky to have a partner right now who is incredibly, very sort of driven by acts of service, right? Whether it's cooking or picking up my dog or doing things for me. And for me, I will often be like, no, I'm fine, But that's part of his love language is to take care of me. And so often my repair is, I'm sorry I rebuffed you. Please, I would love the help. And kind of softening into accepting the support and help, right?
Receivership. Receivership is such a vulnerable state to be in. As you said, especially when you're that hyper independent, competent woman who's got it all together, who has it figured out, who's making the homemade cupcakes for the kids. I never did that part. But, it's really hard to just be in a state of receivership and receive help and receive love, receive money. I mean, there's a lot to that receivership, but what a beautiful way to learn to have a partner who is so giving. I love that. I love that.
Well, I could talk with you all day, Adair, but let's wrap this up so that we can get through. But I think one of the things that really struck me about this conversation, and I feel like is the sort of the thread of everything you do in the world is it always goes back to you, right? It's always like pause, stop, go back, go within. What is my reactivity telling me? What is this? Oh shit, that's what came out of my hand in my journal today telling me. What is the reactivity that I'm on the receiving end from telling me about how I'm showing up? So that is such a sort of core through sort of a thread of everything you do. It's back to me. And I think what I would love to, think about for our listeners is if our listeners could just take away one thing from this conversation. That's the thing that for me is the insight. But do you have something else to share, like an insight, a shift, or maybe like the one habit that you think would be really important to impart?
Oh, wow. Yeah. Well, I would say I agree with you that for me, it always goes back to self-leadership. And that's not, sometimes you could think, oh, that's so selfish. It's quite the opposite. It's this level of humility to say like, wow, I need to take ownership and responsibility for my lived experience and for how I'm showing up and even for how others are showing up to be a mirror for me sometimes. And I would say the thing that leads me back to my own self-responsibility and leadership every single time is pausing. So just learning how, when I'm reactive, when the shit's hitting the fan, when something's not going my way, when I'm feeling off or stuck, pause. Sometimes a pause is 30 seconds. Sometimes it's 2 seconds. Sometimes it's 3 weeks. A pause has lots of different lengths. But, I'll give a little nod to Mo McKenna, who is someone that we deeply love inside of our exchange community. And she says, when you pause a machine, it stops working. When you pause a human, it starts working. So any amount of pausing that we can allow, the spaciousness, the pausing, the stillness, that is the space for us to return to self. And I also think that is how we open to God.
Yeah, I mean, as you were talking, this reminds me of the quote that I've used for, I don't know, over a decade, maybe 20 years in all that I do, because I've been kind of steeped in this in various ways. But for me, it leads back to Viktor Frankl, right? The gap between stimulus and response, that's the source of our freedom. And what you're really alluding to here is that if we want to be free, which for me means, having autonomy, impacting people in the way that is important, showing up for the people that we love in the best ways, serving in this deeply aligned way, connecting with God, connecting with our world, connecting with our environment, connecting with all of the crazy stuff that's going on in the world, and feeling like we can, be resourced, is to step into our own freedom, which is really back to that leading from within, right? None of this works if we don't lead from within.
The world is crazy, and it's not going to get any less crazy. In fact, in some ways, it might get even crazier. But what's the one thing that we can choose? We can choose our response. We can choose to pause. We can choose to resource ourselves. And that's why I think at this day and age, being well-resourced, having a regulated nervous system is really the most important superpower that we can be in the world.
Yeah. It's the well-resourced people that are going to take over the world. Or we're going to be the ones that are left.
Yeah, we're the ones that will survive whatever we get left with.
Oh, my goodness me. Well, thank you so much, Adair, for joining us today on Hot Habits with Dr. Tamsin. I really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you.
You're so welcome. This was wonderful.
Thanks for being here, and thank you for taking the time to listen. Until next time, remember that the way you lead your inner world shapes how you lead on the outside. I'm Dr. Tamsin Adair. Thanks for listening to Hot Habits.